Yeah.
Good afternoon, madam. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I'm hearing you. How are you, ma'am?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Your voice is something breaking now.
Yeah. So what I will do is I'll stop my video. Yeah, I'm okay. How are
Yeah.
you? How is everything with Gwalior?
Fine. It's going on. Okay. Can you check?
Okay, I think my internet connection is very weak. So I will stop my video.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll stop my video
Hmm.
and I'll when once you introduce me, then I will share my slides.
Okay. Fine.
I'm trying to share slides.
Okay.
I think there's some problem. Let's stop and start again. Mhm. Okay. Uh, Dr. Pankaj, it says that I don't have permission. Can you give me permission to
Yeah.
share content?
Yeah. I have given you permission, ma'am.
Okay, let me try again. Right now it's saying
Are you rejoining?
no. I'm trying to share. Shall I share screen or shall I share application?
No, share screen. Share screen.
Okay. Okay. Now, shall I share entire screen or just window?
Entire screen.
Okay. It's not allowing me to.
Okay, one thing you can do, you just leave it and then again you join in.
Okay, I'll try that.
Yeah.
Okay, I've joined. I'll try sharing.
Yeah. Have you shared your content, please, ma'am? Okay. Yeah, you can open your quantum, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you see?
yeah, it's okay. Yeah,
Okay.
it's okay.
Okay, fine.
Okay, it's okay, ma'am.
Okay, good.
So let's start, ma'am.
Yes.
So very good afternoon, ma'am, Professor Kavita Durai. And in this FDP program on quantum computing that is sponsored by ICT, and that's a very promising faculty development program. So right now it is organized by ABV Triple ITM Gwalior. So about Professor Kavita Durai, she's an NMR spectroscopist working at the interface of physics, chemistry, and biology. She is currently a professor in the Department of Physical Sciences at IISER Mohali and the convener of the NMR Research Facility. Professor Durai obtained her MSc in Physics from IIT Kanpur and her PhD in Experimental Physics from ISC Bangalore. After postdoctoral stints at the University of Frankfurt, Germany, and Carnegie Mellon University, USA, she joined the physics department of IIT Madras as a faculty member in 2005. In 2007, she moved to IISER Mohali when the institute was established and has set up the NMR research facility there. She was among the first Indian scientists to work on experimental implementations of NMR quantum computing protocols. Her current research interests include MR quantum computing, multi-party entanglement characterization, decoherence separation protocols, NMR-based metabolomics to study metabolism and circadian rhythms, and evolutionary questions of aging and immunity, NMR methodology, development, and pulse field gradient NMR studies of biomolecules in biological networks. So this is brief uh, biodata of Professor Kavita Gupta, and she has been working, and you know that she has set up MR facility at IISER Mohali, and that is very really great achievement and great approach. So I request Professor Kavita Durai to start her lecture.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Pankaj, for the very nice introduction. First of all, I'm very thankful to the organizers. I'm sure you've been having a wonderful uh, quantum computing conference and listened to lots and lots of talks.
Yeah,
So, by now, you would have also listened to a very senior Professor Anil Kumar speak
yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
quantum information processing.
They
So,
are really in
it
the first on the first day, ma'am.
yes,
Actually,
he is the first. He's
and
also my thesis supervisor.
yeah, yeah.
He's my
You has
guide.
told me. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So I will take off from where Anil kind of he would have broadly introduced the field. So some of the
Okay.
topics I will continue, and then so but you guys can stop me in the middle, or actually I would prefer if questions are asked at the end. So just take a
Okay.
list note of your questions, and you can also type them in the chat box. So let me begin
Hmm.
by
Sir
talking
has also
about.
joined. Sir has also joined, I think.
Okay, that's wonderful. That's
That's
wonderful.
great. That's great. Yeah.
Yes. Um, so let me begin by giving you an insight into what happened at the beginning of the 20th century. So there was a paradigm shift when people shifted from classical to quantum physics, and it was a new way of looking at reality, a new way of envisioning the physical world. A similar paradigm shift occurred in the 21st century when there was a paradigm shift from classical to quantum information. And the real world we live in is quantum. It's truly quantum because the physics is quantum, and now we believe that so is information. And of course, just to uh, keep keep things alive in our minds, it's good to go over, even though you've had several talks by now on this topic, just to give a brief recap. What is a quantum computer? It's a device, and it uses the laws of quantum mechanics to perform a computation. Now, classical bits, as you very well know, work on binary logic, so they can exist in the state 0 or 1. Quantum bits, or qubits in short, on the other hand, can exist not only in eigenstates of a quantum system 0 and 1. We label them 0 or 1, but they could be any levels of a quantum system. For instance, a spin half particle could have spin up and spin down as the two levels, and that is an example of a qubit. Now, as I was saying, qubits can exist not just in eigenstate 0 or eigenstate 1, but they can exist in a superposition of these states. So, with the coefficients alpha and beta. I think somebody's phone is ringing. Can you please mute yourself?
One
Now,
second.
the example of a qubit, like I said, is a spin half particle. And of course, if one has a large number of these qubits, say a large number of spin half particles, all interacting with each other, one can think of them as a chain. Then one can think of a quantum computer having a register of such particles, and all these could exist in superposition. So an example of a superposition state would be a superposition of all these qubits in state 0 plus some coefficient beta times all these qubits in state 1. And what the quantum computer does is it just manipulates these superposition states, performs a computation, and reads out the result. So, what all can a quantum computer do? Of course, we're all looking forward to the good news about quantum computers. First, good news, of course, is storage, because n qubits can store 2 to the power n numbers simultaneously, because we are working in Hilbert space. So, for instance, 3 qubits can store 8 combinations of 0 and 1, and they can do this simultaneously. So, this is a very, very large data that one has at one's fingertips. And if one can store so much data, that is, of course, very good news. The even better news is that a quantum computer can approach very, very fast computational speeds. In fact, that is why everyone is so much interested in building quantum computers and in using them. Because, for instance, like I said, since 3 qubits can simultaneously manipulate 8 combinations of 0 and 1, they can also compute, and hence, since they can work with these superpositions, they can also compute 8 times faster than a corresponding analogous 3-bit classical computer. So, for instance, a 64-bit quantum computer would compute 2 to the power 64 times faster than a 64-bit classical computer, and this is like really, really good news. This is why a lot of algorithms, quantum algorithms like the Shor's quantum factoring algorithm, they hinge on this particular property of the quantum computers. Of course, bad news is that measurement gives a random result, and measurement collapses this superposition that we all know from basic quantum mechanics. Even worse news is that decoherence kills this computation. So the information, even while the computation is proceeding, even while the gates are being implemented, this information is degraded because of noise, because of interaction of the quantum system with with its environment. And as you all have heard, you've heard Professor Arul talk about quantum entanglement, which is a resource for quantum computers and which is very, very fragile. So these correlations which exist as quantum entanglement or quantum coherence, they die out very fast even while the computation is going on. So, although there is a lot of good news about a quantum computer, on the other hand, there's also a lot of, I wouldn't say bad news, maybe alarming news uh, about decoherence, which we need to worry about as people who are building quantum computers. So, this is something that has to go into our design of a quantum computer. So, like I mentioned, entanglement is at the heart of computing speed up, and it refers to correlations between qubits. And what does it mean to have two qubits that are entangled. This means that measuring one qubit, or performing a measurement on one qubit, is always correlated to the measurement of the other qubit. And this is also at the heart of the, for people who are interested in this, you should read up the original papers of Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, which deals with the EPR paradox and gives a very, very beautiful insight into quantum entanglement. There have been several. So QCQI refers to not just quantum computing, but quantum computing and quantum information. There have been several milestones, uh, or one can say, in these different areas. So, for instance, quantum cryptography, um, people have come up with a BB84 quantum key distribution scheme where communication is made secure against eavesdropper attacks, and this for any, for any national security or defense, of any country, any nation. This is an extremely important area of research. Then, of course, comes quantum speed up, and I just mentioned this Shor's prime factoring algorithm, where the prime factors of an integer are, the quantum computer is able to find them out in polynomial time, whereas the corresponding classical algorithm would take exponential time. This means that if I had a classical supercomputer, no matter how fast, but it works on classical binary logic, it would take 14 billion years, which is the age of the universe, to find factors of a 100-digit number. Just imagine. Whereas, I mean, I'm not saying that a quantum computer will. It will crack it. It will take time, but it will take polynomial time, not exponential time. And so this is why people are in most nations are in the race to build a quantum computer, because I've put it here facetiously that if you can build a quantum computer, you can rob a Swiss bank, because most banks, the security of your passwords, they all hinge on the fact that no hacker can use a classical computer and hack into these bank accounts, because it would take them exponential time to generate the prime to find the prime factors of a large integer, a large digit integer, a number. Whereas a quantum, if the hacker had a quantum computer, he or she would be able to do it in polynomial time. The other area where several milestones have been achieved in QCQI is the area of quantum simulation. And this goes back to the initial ideas of Richard Feynman, who said that, why not use quantum systems to simulate other quantum systems? And so there have been several, research research progress in the areas of quantum chemistry, low temperature physics, and condensed matter physics, where Hamiltonians in these of these systems have been simulated using a quantum computer, which focuses on a different quantum technology. So, going back to the words of Richard Feynman, uh, he said that nature isn't classical, and if you want to make a simulation, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. And it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look so easy. And indeed, he said this in 1982, and in 2021 we are on our way, but we've not quite reached there. The other idea, to give you an idea of what it is, how we're manipulating Hilbert space. I like this quote by Samuel Brownstein, who also works, who's a pioneer in QCQI, and he said that imagine a computer whose memory is much larger, exponentially larger than its physical size, a computer that can manipulate an exponential set of inputs simultaneously, a computer that computes in the twilight zone of Hilbert space. And this again is linked with computational speed and how a quantum computer is able to achieve its computational speed up. Of course, we need to have, now that we have these ideas of Feynman and the early people, we needed to have a design as to, what would such a computer be able to do. And we all know that classically you have the algorithmic model, which is a programmable computer. And the earliest ways of looking at this, one could look at it in the words of Alan Turing, who built a Turing machine, who built a thought machine, um, called, where he says that information is real and physical, and he first formalized a model of computation and showed that the notion of programming can be made rigorous. So the Turing machine had an infinite tape. I mean, one can think of an infinite tape subdivided into cells into which symbols were written and erased. Then it had a head to read and write and initialize symbols onto the tape. So the symbols can occupy one cell at a time, and they can either move one cell up or one cell down. Third element of the TM, the Turing machine, of course, was a register, a memory cell, which can be in one of a finite set of configurations. And the fourth component is a controller with an action table to tell the Turing machine how to act. And this also, went into the model of a quantum computer. And like we've just discussed, the basic building blocks are, of course, qubits, which a qubit is a two-level quantum system. One can map binary logical 0 and logical 1 to the eigenstates of the qubit 0 and 1. And of course, like I just told you, so if I have n qubits, they live in a 2 to the power n dimensional Hilbert space. This can be a very large Hilbert space, because n goes into 2 to the power n. Of course, people so far have focused a lot on qubit quantum computing, so computing with these two-level quantum systems. But quantum systems are not restricted to having two levels alone. One can have even more complicated systems, and these are called qubits, where D is for d-dimensional quantum system. So they work on non-binary logic, and the quantum register of such a quantum computer, such a qubit quantum computer, would have d to the power n qubits. So if d was 2 for a qubit, d is 2 for a qubit, then the Hilbert space would be 2 to the power n as elements to perform the computation. Whereas if you had qubits, d level n d level systems, n qubits, then those would be able to compute in an even bigger Hilbert space of d to the power n dimension. So then we come back to our system. So just like Alan Turing had his TM Turing machine and a programmable model, we have a quantum circuit model where the quantum computer, anybody who builds a quantum computer or who works with a quantum computer, would of course first have to prepare an input state. And you'd prepare the input state in the computational basis, where and now we are working with qubit quantum computing. I just mentioned qubit quantum computing just to give you an idea that there are other models or other building blocks that are also possible and that people are now doing research on. So one would of course have to prepare the system in an initial state. Then one would have to evolve, and this evolution is what is the heart of the quantum computation. It is where you apply several gates, and these are all unitary gates, because as you know, in quantum mechanics, evolution of a quantum system is unitary, and these gates are what would implement the computation. So they are, any quantum algorithm can be broken down into these gates, and once you apply these gates on the input state, the system then evolves to a final state, which is the output. And then one can perform a measurement, measure the state of these n qubits in the computational basis, and the output of the computation is this measured state. So the result of the computation has collapsed into this particular state which has been measured, k, ket k, and of course it has its probability. Now, since quantum mechanics evolution is unitary, people had to use reversible logic. They found that the normal logic, digital logic of gates using, say, a NOT gate or an AND gate, all those would not work because they're irreversible gates. By irreversible, I mean that from the state of the output, you cannot you cannot reverse the computation, you cannot reverse the gate and see what was the state of what was the input state. So people came up with, they did a lot of work and they came up with reversible logic gate, and one such gate is a controlled NOT gate. What this control NOT gate does is it flips one spin. So it flips the target, it flips the state of the target spin. Either if the target is 0, it makes it 1. If the target is 1, it makes it 0, depending on the state of the control spin. So if the control spin is in the state 0, this gate does nothing to the target, so it leaves it. So 0 0 will remain 0 0, 0 1 will remain 0 1. Whereas if control qubit is in state 1, then it will flip the state of the target qubit. So 1 0 will become 1 1, and 1 1 will become 1 0. So now you see that the set of outputs is uniquely correlated with the set of inputs, and that is why this gate is called a reversible gate. And it has been shown that this gate, using this gate and a set of 1 qubit rotations, one can construct any circuit. So these are universal, this is a set of universal quantum gates, and if you can construct any circuit, you can perform any quantum computation, you can implement any quantum algorithm. Then people, this was in the early days, so people were still wondering, okay, so I can use an algorithmic model, I can build a circuit. What are the other criteria that I need in order to build a quantum computer? And David DiVincenzo came up with 5 criteria, which were later expanded to 7. But initially, of course, you need to have scalable physical system with identifiable qubits. That means that you should be able to have a quantum system which has a large number of these spin half particles, or any two level quantum systems, qubits which are interacting with each other. Of course, this quantum computer should have an ability to initialize the state of these qubits. So you need to know what is your input state, and only then you can perform various computations on it. The system should have a long decoherence time. Remember, in the beginning, I told you that decoherence is what kills a quantum computation. So, if a system has long decoherence times, or at least longer than the gates that have to be implemented, then that is good for us. The system, you should be able to implement a universal set of quantum gates. That means you need very precise quantum control, and quantum control and engineering is also a sub area of QCQI that a lot of people are interested in and are working on. And of course, finally, once you've applied your measurement, once you've protected your system against decoherence, once you have performed your computation, you need to be able to measure, and you need to be able to read out the result of your computation. So that is, you should be able to go and look at any qubit and see what has happened to it after the quantum computer has implemented the algorithm. So these are the 5 criteria. Of course, sometimes I'll come back to this later, but sometimes readout is possible in many different ways. And one of the ways is, instead of reading out directly, you reconstruct or measure the density matrix. At the moment, I'll just leave it here and then come back to this slide later on when I talk about things in more detail. There are now several likely candidates for building a physical quantum computer. NMR, or nuclear magnetic resonance, which I'll talk about in more detail in the rest of my talk, was one of the oldest implementations of a quantum computer. Then there are ion traps, vacancy centers in diamonds, polarization states of photons, solid state spin, superconducting devices, and so on. So, to give you an idea, this is what these days what a quantum computer would look like, whether you want to use ions or photons or NMR or superconducting qubits. So now I come to, what is NMR? So just to remind you, Anil would have spoken about all of this. NMR, the N in NMR stands for nuclei, and one can visualize these nuclei as having a magnetic moment mu, which is proportional to I, where I is the spin angular momentum. Gamma and h cross are, of course, constants. Gamma is called the gyromagnetic ratio, and it it's an intrinsic property of the type of the nucleus. So if it's a proton, it has a one particular value of gamma. If your nucleus happens to be carbon 13, it has a different value of this quantity gamma. The classical picture that one can visualize of this spin, I mean, spins are quantum objects, but if you must think of them, if you need to think of them, picture them classically, then one can visualize them as a small magnetic top which is spinning on its own axis. And so that's what has been visualized here. There's this green ball which is like a top, and it's spinning around its axis. The M in NMRs comes from magnetic. So what happens is that you typically we have an ensemble of these nuclear spins. They're all spinning around their axes. They all have magnetic moments mu. Now they're placed in a magnetic field, and I have placed the static. I've denoted this as B0. You can see this big orange arrow over here. It's pointing in the positive Z direction, and I place these spinning tops. And what happens to them? They all start precessing. And precessional motion you're all familiar with from your basic mechanics courses, where one can think of a top which is spinning in the Earth's gravitational field. And so precessional motion is motion in a cone around the direction of the field. So in this case, it's a magnetic field, and you have a magnetic moment, and it is precessing around, and the precise precessional frequency is omega, which is called the Larmor frequency, named after the physicist Larmor who discovered this. And it is proportional to the strength of the static magnetic fields. So that's what I've written down here, that omega is gamma times B0. So the greater the B0, the faster these spins precess, or the larger or higher this gyromagnetic ratio, this number gamma, the faster the spins precess. So the magnet is switched on, the spin starts precessing, and it so turns out, for reasons we will not go into in detail, but these spins can orient themselves either along the magnetic field or anti-parallel to the field. And the ones which are aligned along the magnetic field, they have lower energy. So this leads to a net magnetization. So if I can, decompose these magnetic moment vectors, these mu vectors along the z, x, and y directions, the vector components along the x, y, they sort of average out to zero. So that's what I've written over here in orange. And what remains is a slight excess magnetization, which is because, remember, I told you that there are spins which have a lower energy, which point to which point along the magnetic field along the positive z direction, and all of these add up, and there is an excess magnetization or a net magnetization, which I've denoted here by M0 on the rightmost side, and this is aligned along B0 in the positive z direction. Now we come to the R part of NMR. So N was nuclear, M was magnetic, R is resonance. And resonance again is a phenomenon that you all are familiar with from your early mechanics courses. Remember this idea that soldiers are told to march out of step when they reach a bridge. And why is that? Because soldiers, when they march in step, they are in resonance, and when they march onto the bridge, in case the frequency of their marching steps matches the natural resonance frequency of the bridge, because all objects vibrate, all objects have natural frequencies of vibration. If these two frequencies match, if there's a resonance between them, then energy transfer can happen, and the amplitude of vibration of the bridge can be so large that the bridge can actually break. And this has happened in real life. If you go to YouTube and search for Tacoma Bridge disaster, this happened in the early 1930s in the US, where the resonance of wind along the river match the resonance frequency of the bridge, and it was like a storm, and it was so much so that the bridge broke even while cars were driving on it. So this is what happens. The same thing happens in the NMR system, that if I apply a frequency of which is, which matches the Lama frequency of the spins, which matches their intrinsic precessional frequency, then resonance can occur, and these spins can absorb this energy which has been applied, and then that tips the magnetization, which was at equilibrium, it was pointing along the z direction. Now these spins absorb this energy, the magnetization is tipped into the xy plane, and of course, what happens to any system which is excited, it wants to relax back to equilibrium, and equilibrium is along the positive z direction. So the magnetization which has been tipped into the xy plane, it will want to give off energy back to its surroundings. In this case, it happens to be the coil, and that coil induces. So this is it's a current which induces a field, and this can be picked up, and this is what is the NMR signal. So once the spins are they've absorbed energy, they get excited, they relax back to their ground state, to their equilibrium, and once they do that and give off that energy which they had absorbed, this emission energy is what. So NMR is an emission spectrum. This is what an NMR spectroscopist picks up and of course amplifies and analyzes. So that is the NMR signal, and that is what I've depicted for you here in this picture, that the NMR signal which is given off into the receiver coil is picked up and amplified. And this is a block diagram of an NMR spectrometer. It basically consists of the superconducting magnet, which produces that B0 static magnetic field. There is an RF circuitry which applies pulses, which applies the RF field in order to tip the equilibrium magnetization into the XY plane. The probe is it's called probe because it probes the spins, and it's basically a casing with this RF coil wrapped around the sample, wrapped around the spins. And the transmitter transmits the RF, the receiver receives the NMR signal, and of course, you have a computer, the workstation, which is at the heart of everything and keeps track of everything and analyzes the signal. So, this is what a typical this is a 900 megahertz spectrometer, which is one of the highest available magnetic fields, and this is what an NMR machine looks like. So that was a classical picture, right? Because I wanted to give you an idea of what is NMR and how to visualize it and what is a signal. But of course, we know that the world that we live in is quantum mechanical, and this applies to NMR as well. And one would, for in the quantum picture, one would have discrete energy states. Here we call it a Zeeman splitting, and the splitting between the energy levels delta E is proportional again to gamma, is equal to gamma h cross B0. And typically for B0 in Tesla, the magnetic field in Tesla, the frequency is in the RF range. So these are radio frequencies. Spins resonate in the range of 10 to 100 of megahertz. And of course, this is not the end of the story, because if that was it, then people would not be interested in using NMR as a technique to probe systems. So if all the nuclei in a sample, they all resonated at the same frequency, then at the same Lama frequency, you would only see, you'd be able to excite them, but they would all give off signal at the same frequency, and you would only see one line, which is not very interesting. But suppose, as is the case in real life, suppose these nuclei have slightly differing chemical environments. So say the surrounding electron cloud is different for different protons in a nucleus. For instance, I could have a substitution in a benzene molecule of a fluorine in the third position instead of a proton, and that would mean that each of the protons would see a slightly different magnetic field. So the depending on how shielded or deshielded, how much of the electron, how dense the electron cloud is or not, the nucleus would see either a less or a more field. And these different, slightly different, remember I told you that the Lama frequency depends on the field. So the field the effective field, the B effective, that these nuclei see will be slightly different because of their slightly different nuclei of the slightly different chemical environment, and because of that they would resonate at slightly different Lama frequencies, and because of that you would be able to pick up signals of slightly different frequencies, and so you would have many lines in the NMR spectrum depending on the different effective magnetic fields that each nucleus sees. This is not the only kind of information that NMR can get. You can also get distance information, and this is a slightly more complicated phenomena. At the moment, we'll just say that distance information can also be got from by using NMR. One can also use gradients. So you're all aware that of MRI. MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, also works on the same principles of NMR, except that now we are imaging water, and of course, all water protons will resonate at the same frequency. So one can use a gradient along the magnetic field, along that static magnetic field, linearly say vary the gradient, and this encodes spatial information. So instead of knowing of picking them out in frequency space as we did using chemical shift information, now you can use gradients and pick them out in space, and so you'd be able to image water coming from say a tumor, and water from the surrounding tissue. This could be differentiated depending on where the water is localized. Is it inside the tumor or is it in the rest of the brain? And that's the principle of MRI. Of course, like I told you, there are several spins and they all resonate at slightly different frequencies. They could be hundreds of spins which do so. And then it's a very painful procedure. People used to do this in the old days, and that was called CW, or continuous wave NMR, where you had to go and it was like, if you imagine having a piano, and each of the piano keys, if you press it, excites a spin corresponding to that particular frequency. Of course, there in a piano you're talking about audio frequencies. For spins you need radio frequencies, but just imagine that you press a key, that spin gets excited and it gives off its signal, and you can record it. Do you want to record a different resonance of a different nucleus? You have to press the next key, and so on and so forth. So you have to do this sequentially, and it took a lot of time. It took several hours. Then people came up with the idea that why not use a mathematical technique which is called a Fourier transform. Now, what does a Fourier transform do? It just transforms the same information which is present in two different domains, and in our case the domain are time and frequency. So time, of course, is the NMR signal, and you know that it's an oscillating signal because it's a frequency, right? It oscillates at that Lama frequency, and it also decays because it has to go back to equilibrium. So this time decaying signal, um, which has a damped, so it would be like, if I had to uh, you know look at the signal, if I had to write down the signal in time mathematically, I would describe it as a function s of t as some amplitude a, times and damping constant, say e to the power minus gamma t, times some cos omega 0 t, where omega 0 is the Lama frequency. Now if I take a Fourier transform of that, some of you who are doing MSc might be aware that a Fourier transform of a decaying sinusoid would be a Lorentzian, or I could have a Fourier transform of a pulse, a rectangular shape, which is what I've depicted here, and the Fourier transform of that would be a sinc function, which is given on the right, a sin x by x. So it's like, going back to our piano analogy, it is like having, smashing all the keys all at once. So all the frequencies are given to the system, all the spins get excited at once. You record that signal in time, which is all these decaying sinusoids put together, and you take a Fourier transform, and you're able to pick out each of those. You're able to unfold or unravel this information, which is all mashed up in the time domain signal, and it is, you're able to beautifully unravel this information, and you'll be able to get to this information, make sense of it in just a few seconds. And that's what I've written down here. So the pulse, which has a rectangular envelope, is a combination of a wave which is at the Lama frequency and a step function. It's actually a convolution of, or a combination of, these two functions. And if you take a Fourier transform, it gives a signal which is centered at the Lama frequency. So this is the NMR spectrum. It's called an FID, the one on the left, which is a free induction decay. Induction because the signal is induced in the receiver coil, free because now the spins are free to relax back to equilibrium, and D for decay because they're decaying back to equilibrium. And if I take a Fourier transform, this is what I get, and this is the NMR spectrum. Now we come to the idea of the using building blocks. So now here in NMR, we've been dealing with spin half particles all along. So we will think of these spin half particles as qubits. So I've just depicted for you a molecule. Say I have a molecule of trichloroethylene, and I have marked the qubits for you. So there's a proton in red, and there are two carbons. I've called them C1 and C2. These are two carbon 13 spins. These are all spin half particles, and they're all coupled to each other. So H is coupled to C1 and C2, C1 is coupled to H and C2, and C2 is coupled to H and C1. And I can think of writing the state of these three spins. So three qubits, all know, can have 2 to the power 3, 8 possible combinations of states. So the eigenstates of this quantum computer, this 3-qubit quantum computer, would run from 000, 001, 010, and all along, all the way down to 111. And one particular state that I've depicted here is a 010. So the proton is oriented up along the magnetic field. The first carbon is oriented down, and so that is represented by by logical 1, and the second carbon is again oriented up. So this state corresponds to 010. And similarly, if I can manipulate these spins and push them into specific states, or combinations or superpositions of states, then I can manipulate my quantum computer. So the first criteria of De Vincenzo, remember he said that we should have a system where we can address these qubits which have a qubit register. So that is what this is what an NMR quantum computer looks like, or this is a visualization of one particular state of an NMR quantum computer. And of course, you're well aware of by now that you would have done this in detail, that I can visualize a spin half as a vector on the Bloch sphere. So I can make any kind of manipulation, and in general, the state of this state of the spin half can be represented by 0 plus e to the power I phi times the eigenstate, logical eigenstate 1. Now in NMR, I don't have a single spin system. I have an ensemble of spins, and usually, remember going back to again the De Vincenzo criteria, we need for QCQI, we need that the quantum register should be initialized into a pure state. And if I have an ensemble of spins, the pure state would be that each member of the ensemble is described by the same state vector, same psi vector. Now this, for an ensemble is not possible. We need to have a density operator or a density matrix which has to describe. So the complete description of the quantum system comes from, for an ensemble, comes from the density operator, which is in some sense which incorporates the idea of classical probabilities into this large ensemble. And so nuclear spins at thermal equilibrium, they're highly mixed, so they can't be aligned parallel to B0 at temperatures above 1 milli K. So one cannot make a pure state. So you would say, oh my gosh, then the NMR quantum computer falls at the first gate. So, and this is a problem because if quantum algorithms are executed on such a mixed ensemble, then averaging over the ensemble might just kill the result of your computation, and you would not be able to. I mean, they would have performed the computation, but just the fact that they're all in mixed states, the ensemble is mixed, averaging over it, you will not be able to read out the result of your computation. So how do we circumvent this problem? In NMR, people have done this, that initially the Boltzmann distribution of populations, the spins are in a Boltzmann distribution, and it has a bias towards the ground state. Remember, I said that there's a slight excess of spin magnetization along uh, the positive z direction, along the direction of the static magnetic field. So what one does is that one makes a pseudo pure. It's not a pure state, but it's a pseudo pure state. So imagine that most of the spins are in this identity part of the density operator. So I have rho, which is a density operator. PP stands for pseudo pure, and I have 1 minus alpha of the spins in the identity. I stands for identity, and I have alpha in this 0, 0 state. Okay, so it's a very small number. For typical values of the gyromagnetic ratio and the static magnetic field, alpha is the order of 10 power minus 5. So of course this is, but it's better than nothing. This particular alpha number of spins, they are in that pure state, and whatever happens to the identity, we treat that as a background. Nothing happens to the identity, it doesn't evolve under any NMR pulses, so we're not interested in it. So we say that all our computation, all the quantum computation that is happening, we're only going to look at those spins which have been pushed into this pseudo pure state. And of course, these are the spins that will respond to the gates, those unitary operations, and the identity term will remain unchanged. And so we need a high enough alpha to produce some acceptable experimental signal to noise ratio. There are various kinds of NMR interactions and interaction terms in the NMR Hamiltonian, which I will not go through in detail. There are two main types: a dipolar and a scalar coupling interaction. These are just the ways the spins talk to each other, and this is important for a quantum computer because you need to have interactions. Only then, if the qubits can talk to each other, can you push them into superpositions of states or into entangled states, and only then can you really implement a quantum computation. So this is a single qubit Hamiltonian. We can make a rotating frame transformation. It's a two qubit Hamiltonian. And then we come to implementing gates in NMR. So like I said, it's all a game of RF. These are radio frequency, the spins precess at radio frequencies. The Lama frequencies are in the megahertz range, and so we need to map gates like this control not gate or the not gate onto these RF pulses, and typically they represented by a propagator. So you need to evolve the quantum system, which is in some state, that particular pseudo pure state, for instance, and we apply RF pulses for a particular duration. And for instance, I can have um, these rotations which are oriented, which have some flip angle. I call that flip angle because it flips the magnetization around. It manipulates that magnetization vector, if you please, and uh, of some frequency and some time, and that is the amplitude. And I can have alpha as along x or along y, the phase. And in NMR, I can't implement rotations about the z axis, but I can do that indirectly by again decomposing these z rotations around using using cascades of pulses. So this is an example of a one qubit rotation of an angle theta and a phase phi. And for instance, a one qubit rotation would be applying a Hadamard gate. The unitary corresponding to that is a 1 by root 2 1 1 1 minus 1. And how would I achieve that in NMR? I would achieve that by using two pulses, a pi by 2 pulse, so a pulse of flip angle pi by 2 and phase y, followed by a pulse of flip angle pi and phase x. So applying these two pulses, with that I can implement the Hadamard gate. So similarly, I can implement several different gates. So I can have 1 qubit gates, which I just showed you, the Hadamard gate, two qubit gates, and like we talked about in detail. So I can, in NMR, I can implement this control NOT gate using a set of two pulses pi by 2x, followed by free evolution under the NMR Hamiltonian, whatever interaction terms are there, for a time period 1 by 2j, where j is some constant. At the moment, we are not very bothered what it is. So the set of these three things, two pulses and one free delay, is able to implement the control NOT gate. Now, if I have all these gates, of course, then I can put them together and I can implement any kind of algorithm. So what the quantum algorithm does is it encodes you can encode the quantum circuit using gates, these pulses and delays that we talked about, into the spectrometer or into the machine's language, and then you implement your algorithm. Readout again is a bit of a problem because projective measurements are not possible in NMR. So, and transitions follow the delta m plus minus 1, the dipole quantum mechanical selection rule. But the nice thing is that qubits in an NMR register, they have different Lama frequencies. That's what we just talked about. They have different chemical shifts, so they are addressable in frequency space. And one could, measure the free induction decay, which I had talked about, and one can also perform quantum state tomography, which I had mentioned earlier. So, like I said, for an ensemble of spins, you need a density operator to fully describe the quantum state. This has 2 to the power 2n elements, which is more than the amount contained in a single NMR spectrum. So what you do is you perform a set of measurements and then you reconstruct or tomograph. Tomograph means slicing. So you take different slices of the density operator, and by doing that and putting all these slices together, you're able to reconstruct or tomograph the full density operator. This I will not. So there have been many success stories of NMR. Excuse me. We began with gates and implementing very simple algorithms like Grover's search, the Deutsch toy algorithm, then went on to quantum Fourier transform, and now there are many success stories. In fact, Shor's quantum factoring, and then NMR has also been used to generate and characterize multi-qubit entanglement. It's been used as a test bed for decoherence models for one-way quantum computing, and now people are also trying to use it for QDIT quantum computing, where QDIT, as I told you, lives in a higher dimensional space, where d is greater than 2, d is equal to 2 for a qubit. So this is the circuit they used early on to implement Shor's quantum factoring algorithm on an NMR system. They use 7 qubits and they factored the number 15, and they used lots and lots, hundreds of pulses to do and delays to do this. So the first arena of achievement, I would say, has been in quantum algorithms, and there have been several NMR people who have, tried to implement Shor's quantum factoring algorithm of larger and larger primes, of larger and larger numbers, finding the primes of larger and larger numbers. The second arena, of course, is in simulation, quantum simulation. So there's been a lot of work done in quantum chemistry simulation of molecular hydrogen, obtaining ground state energy of hydrogen and helium, and so on. On quantum chaos, implementing quantum Baker's map, uh, on simulation of noise processes or quantum channels using NMR. Then the third, of course, is in decoherence suppression, because, like I said, decoherence is something that we all are scared of and we want to suppress. And people have used optimal control techniques like grape, genetic algorithms, machine learning, Urich dynamical decoupling schemes, quantum error correction schemes. So this also NMR quantum computing has been very successful in. The fourth arena is a very interesting arena, which is contribution to foundational issues. So, like I said, I've mentioned before quantum computing using qubits and characterization of multipartite entanglement, bound entanglement, and then the role of something called quantum contextuality, which is very different from, which is a different beast from quantum entanglement, and how possibly it can be used just like quantum entanglement has been used for computational speed up in quantum algorithms. People are now trying to figure out whether quantum contextuality can be used in quantum systems for in quantum computers to achieve a speed up. So this is a summary of an NMR quantum computer. It's the first prototype quantum computer which worked. Well, I shouldn't say currently. It has a large qubit register size of around 12 to 15 qubits. There are others now in the race. There's a high degree of quantum control. So all those RF pulses, one can achieve them with a very high degree of quantum control. So one can manipulate these qubits, NMR qubits, very precisely. The qubit-qubit interactions are tunable. The decoherence times, intrinsic decoherence times of NMR systems are very long. There are several schemes already available for decoherence suppression. Initialization and readout is not done in on the way it is done on a conventional, if you wish, if you allow me to use that word, on a conventional quantum computer. But people have worked around this problem and used pseudo pure states for initial states, and they've used quantum state tomography for readout. And there have been lots of success stories in algorithmic implementation, quantum control, quantum simulation, and so on. So, and it's a robust quantum technology which is translated to other quantum hardware. So this kind of course, the challenges are that, like I said, these ensembles are mixed, and so can one increase spin polarization? Can one use different schemes to do so? Can one increase register size beyond 30, 20, or 30 qubits? Can one use different models like qudits for quantum computing, or one-way quantum computing, or have hybrid, so marry two quantum technologies like NMR and solid state, and see what happens. So that's the future. Now, since I have about half an hour, I will tell you a little bit of the research that my group has been doing. I understand that these talks are aimed at a popular audience, so I'll try to make it as popular as I can. So, coming to the idea of quantum control, this is very essential for quantum computing because, as you know, quantum computers rest on certain intrinsic quantum features like entanglement, which are correlations, which I talked about earlier on in this talk, and these are very fragile. So they are very prone to, and all, of course, quantum gates also, while implementing them, there can be lots of errors, and decoherence can destroy the quantum computation even before you read it out. So all these problems need a solution, and there are several optimization techniques which have been used by people. For instance, grape, genetic algorithms, machine learning algorithms, all of which are aimed at trying to implement very precise gates and trying to uh, optimize schemes to control or suppress decoherence. So this is how the grape flowchart works. Uh, Say I want to implement a particular unitary, I would then try to optimize, and unitary of course corresponds to say one quantum gate, and I would divide up this the profile of the gate into a series of steps. So it would have of a particular amplitude, a particular duration, and that's so you can see from 0 to t. One has broken up this profile of the gate into a series of steps, and the arrows represent gradients. So how to, depending on what happens in the previous step, how to modify each amplitude in the next iteration, and this the computer does. This is done by optimizing some kind of error function to improve the performance of the gate. And one can also use a genetic algorithm, which my lab has used. So this is a set of um, pulses, a particular gate which has been optimized for errors due to offset and the flip error in the flip angle of the pulse, and we used a genetic algorithm to optimize these 3-qubit quantum gates, and we achieved a high performance. Then of course, like I said, apart from quantum control and dealing with errors, one also needs schemes to protect these fragile quantum states against decoherence. And a whole class of these techniques are called DD, or dynamical decoupling methods. What happens is that, why does the system decohere? Why does the quantum computing result, why is it washed away? It's washed away because of decoherence. And what is decoherence? This is just interaction between the system and the environment. So the system is talking to, here I've called the environment the bath, because that's what it's typically called. um, so you can see that the system is interacting with its environment, and we don't want this crosstalk to happen, because the system is then giving off the correlation information, and that correlation information is being lost to the environment. So what DD methods do is they aim to, the goal is simple. Goal is, let's stop the system from talking to the bath. So let's decouple this system bath coupling. And how does one do that? How does a DD method do that? Excuse me. It does that by adding some periodic decoupling interaction. So it's like interrupting this crosstalk that is happening between the system and the bath with some cycle time. So over and over and over again, you keep adding this decoupling interaction. So you're kind of interrogating the system bath Hamiltonian. You're telling it, don't talk. Are you talking? Don't talk. Are you talking? Don't talk. So this happens, this interruption happens for after n cycles, where tc is the cycle time. It would have happened for ntc. So the system now evolves under this effective average Hamiltonian, and in that time period, when the system is being interrogated by this decoupling interaction, there are no system bath interaction terms. Now the simplest DD sequence actually was found many decades ago in NMR by CPMG, which were a set of four physicists: Carr, Purcell, Maiboom, and Gill. And they used a train of, by train I mean a long set, a train of equally spaced pi pulses. So pulses of flip angle pi and phase say x, and they kept applying that, and they were able to at every stage, in some sense, kick back the system to where it was and stop it from talking to its environment, stop it from decohering. So these are various kinds. That was the CPMG is the simplest kind, but there are several kinds of decoupling sequences. uh, some of them are time symmetric, and they all rely on this idea of having, maybe not equally spaced, but having a set of these pulses, um, with some duration between them. And and the set is repeated time and time again. Like I said, it's cycled many times during the course of the computation. So, and now we come to what we did in our lab. Was we implemented a Zeno scheme. And the Zeno paradox goes back to a Greek philosopher who's around 430 BC, who said that motion is an illusion. So what he did was, I mean, his method, of course, was proof by contradiction. And if you're interested further, you should go and read this book by Douglas Hofstadter called Gödel Escher Bach, which has a beautiful description of the Zeno paradox. Now, what the quantum Zeno effect is that it uses frequent measurements project or to kick the quantum system back to its initial state. And this is a, it's like saying a watched pot never boils, right? So if you keep on opening the lid of the pot and seeing whether the water is boiled or not, the water will never boil. And that's the same, you know same idea behind the quantum zeno, that we go on measuring the system, we go on interrogating the system, and saying, have you evolved? No, go back to your initial state. Have you evolved? No, go back to your initial state. And that way you can slow down the time evolution of the system and stop it from recovering. So this is the super zeno scheme. There are various, this is the kick. It's called the the J is called the kick operator because it kicks the system, the state, back to its initial state. Um, and this is the NMR circuit that we constructed, the quantum circuit, to to preserve a particular state. So we preserved this singlet state. We took 2 qubits, and we decided that we were going to preserve this singlet state and not bother about what happens to the other three states. And then we applied this super zeno. So you can see that without applying, SZ stands for super zeno, without applying the super zeno, the state decoers pretty fast. And with applying the super zeno, and with a very high fidelity for up to 8 seconds, we were able to protect the state or stop it from evolving. And we did that for many different kinds of states, different kinds of subspaces. We did it for entangled states, and we found that again, with super zeno the entanglement is preserved, whereas without super zeno it's not preserved. Now I come to another topic that we embarked upon in our lab, and that was, I talked about the idea that instead of using quantum entanglement, can one use contextuality to achieve computational speed up when implementing a quantum algorithm. So for that, some of the questions one can ask is, um, like, what happens to elements of physical reality when we look, and what happens to them when we are not looking, and what is the context of your measurement, or what is the context of your observation. For instance, wherever you're living, whether you're living in Gwalior, or you're living in Iceland, or you're living in Izamohali is lots of peacocks. So if you open your garage door in the morning, will you find a peacock? The answer is maybe. It depends on whether your garage is in Kolkata or Gwalior or Izamohali or Iceland, right? So the then there's also the idea of the observer and the observed. So what happens to the state of an electron when it's not being watched, when it's not being observed? And then of course we have Bell's theorem, that if a hidden variable model is local, it can be ruled out experimentally. So that is, what that depends on whether an observable is contextual or not. By that I mean that if you measure, say I have three observables, A, B, and C, and I want to make a measurement on A, and I want to ask the question, is this observable A, is it contextual or not? So what I do is I make a measurement of A simultaneous with another observable B, and I make a measurement of the same observable A with a third observable C. So I make measurements of AB and AC, and if I get the same expectation value for A, that means it is non-contextual. But if I get different values, so depending on what it has been observed along with, what it has been measured along with, if its expectation value changes, that means that it is contextual. Okay. So this is what has been encapsulated in the Cochen-Specker theorem. And we wanted to test out this concept of contextuality on an NMR quantum computer. and this is just a way of visualizing. So we took a single qubit. A qubit is a qubit, so it has b equal to 3. It's the 3 level quantum system. And we said that if we make, so imagine that there is this graph, it's a mathematical graph, and it has certain orthogonality relations. So E is the edge, and there are these dotted lines tell you that can I make simultaneous observations of these observables or not. So and the Kochen-Specker, this sorry Kozinski theorem says that if I make 9 measurements, then whatever single qubit state I have, I can reveal whether that state is contextual or not. So this is more of a math, which I will skip. Mm, I'll skip this as well. So finally, it all. If you look at the last equation on the at the bottom of the slide, it all boiled down to this: that if I'm able to measure these particular expectation values, lambda 1, lambda 3, lambda 4, lambda 6, lambda 8, and with these coefficients, with these constants before them, and if I'm able to sum up all of these expectation values, um, if it is less than 0, that means the single qubit state is contextual. So that means that if this inequality is greater than equal to 0, if it is violated, if my answer turns out to be less than 0, then this quantum state that I've constructed is contextual. And this is the NMR qubit. We used a chloroform which is oriented in a lyotropic liquid crystal. These are the interaction terms. And we this is a quantum circuit. We measured, like I said, we measured different expectation values, and we used 4 experiments. We followed the violation in time and plotted the 4 states at these different time points, just to see how far can we go in time, how long do they remain contextual. And we found that they retain their contextuality for quite some time. We also tested various other inequalities in larger dimensional Hilbert spaces, using the same ideas. We followed the inequality violation, and I will. Well, I have about 10 more minutes, so I'll just say that we move on to. So that was contextuality, interrogating contextuality, and seeing whether NMR states are contextual or not, and that depended on the violation of that particular inequality that we constructed. Then we also wanted to look at entanglement in the NMR context. So, like I said, initially these spins, all this ensemble of spins, is in thermal equilibrium. It's highly mixed. So the question then begs the question that are these entangled or not? And there are two ways to look at the situation. Remember, I said that this is a highly mixed ensemble, especially at high temperatures, at the temperatures that we are working with. So if you consider the entire spin ensemble, then of course you can't say anything about entanglement. But instead, if you choose to focus on that pseudo pure sub ensemble, then of course that part, even though it's very small, genuine entanglement does exist in that part of the density matrix. So we constructed for 3 qubits, there are two inequivalent classes of states. These are inequivalent under SLOCC. That means that you cannot make a local operation which will take you from the GHZ state to the W state or vice versa. And it was also shown theoretically, it was posited that all pure 3 qubit states can be constructed from a generic state which has these parameters. So A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, and a phase. And we constructed a circuit to prepare generic states, and from that we were able to create different kinds of states like the W and the GHZ and so on. And we also found a very surprising fact, which was stated by Linden and Wouters, that except for the GHZ class of states, for any generic pure state, the parts determine the whole. That means that if you all information about this generic three-party state is contained in the three two-party reduced states. So if I make a measurement on row BC or row AB or row AC for a three-party ABC quantum system, I can reconstruct the information. It's as if by measuring these reduced states, it's as if I have measured the full tripartite correlated state, row ABC. So that's the protocol that we implemented, and we found that indeed for the W state we were able to, get all information using these tomographs about the full three qubit W state from the two qubit reduced density states, row AB and row BC. You can use any two of these three to do so. Then we also went on to look at a new kind of three-party entanglement called a W bar. Now, W is a state which is, 1 by root 3 of 0, 0, 1 plus 0, 1, 0 plus 0, 1, 1. W bar, of course, is its inverse or its obverse. And if you sum both of these, you get the W bar state. And this has very interesting entanglement properties. So it belongs to the GHZ state of class. However, it stores entanglement like the W class. Now remember I told you that the GHZ and the W class of states, they are inequivalent entanglement classes. So you can't, they are in different domains of entanglement. They're different classes or types of entanglement altogether. And this WW bar state seems to have the properties of both. So, what do I mean by saying that it stores entanglement like the W class? That means that information about this state, this WW bar state, is contained in its two-party reduced states. Now, remember, I had talked about this, that the GHZ state, you cannot, information about GHZ is not contained in its two-party, whereas information about W is contained in its two-party. So now here is this WW bar, which is a totally new, different kind of entangled state, which belongs to the GHZ entanglement class, but correlation information about this three qubit state can be brought out by measuring its two-party reduced states. So this is what we did. This is our circuit. We filtered these states, converted a WW bar to GHZ. This is a quantum circuit and the corresponding NMR pulse sequence. This is our reconstruction, and we were able to capture correlation information about the three-party WW bar state from a set of two-party reduced density matrix with quite a high fidelity of 91%. And I will stop here. I'm almost done. And I must say that none of this would have been possible without my PhD students. And they're the ones who do the work. And I'm able to present this work before you. So I'm very thankful to all of them. And of course, I acknowledge my collaborators and my funding partners. Arvind is a theoretical physicist at IISER Mohali. We have a long-term collaboration on quantum computing, so most of the QC work has been done in collaboration with Arvind. I collaborate with others on NMR metabolomics, which of course I have not talked about here. And I must acknowledge, especially grateful to DST, QUST for funding in the pandemic for NMR quantum computing, and to STARS MHRD for funding for NMR metabolomics. And I leave you with a slide with a photo of the night campus of IISER Mohali taken by my PhD student Akshay Gaikwad. Thank you for your attention, and I can take questions now.
Thank you, ma'am. It's a really very fascinating lecture. And now it's time to ask questions from participants.
Shall I stop sharing my slides or shall I keep them?
Yeah, you can share to me, no problem. Then if they ask, then I can give them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So participants, can you ask any question? Any question related to this talk? You can also go through chat also. Yes. Dr. Ankur Vishwas.
This is Anil Kumar. It's a very beautiful lecture, Kavita.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Anil.
sir.
So nice of you to attend.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Very nice lecture. Very educative.
Yeah, really. Okay, sir. Actually, ma'am, that's a very beautiful campus, and I would like to say that in my campus also there are a lot of peacocks are here.
Okay. So
So
good.
really,
We can make it.
yeah, I have also visited your campus
Yes.
once time in 2018 somewhere or 17,
Okay.
and I have stayed in your guest house in
Oh,
conference.
okay.
That is in somewhere in Punjab University or Chandigarh University.
That's
So I visited really. It's a very beautiful campus of yours.
Thank you.
And
I
very
hope you
good
visit
campus.
again once.
Yeah. I visited your campus. I stayed in your guest house.
Yes, and I hope once this pandemic clears up, people are
Yeah,
able to visit once again. So I invite
sure,
you.
sure. You're also welcome here, ma'am. If
Yes,
you
definitely,
go
definitely.
here, it's a very historical place.
Yes, indeed.
Sure. So thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
much.
madam. It was a
Thank
great
you
talk.
for your
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks. So this is the end of the today's sessions now, and tomorrow we have a session for quantum noise and error corrections by Atul Kumar, IIT Jodhpur. So meet you in the morning. No one is asking questions. Someone is here from participants. Yes, Ankur Vishwas and
Yes, sir.
Ashok Ashish Pathak is here. Ankur Vishwas is here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am here, sir.
Okay, fine.
No, as such question. It was
Yeah.
quite well explained. So, as such, I do
Right.
not have much questions, sir.
Okay. Senthil Kumar. Senthil Kumar is here. Dr. Ritesh Kumar, Dr. Kamal, Dr. Ankita Banerjee Jain. Because, the session would be more fruitful if it will have some kind of interaction with the resource persons. Okay. So meet you. We'll meet looking to the morning session. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Ritesh Yadav, yes. Please have a questions with our resource persons because that will be more fruitful if you take interaction with them. If you really wants to work in that direction. Okay. So because this is a new topic and a new area of the research domain, and in the coming future, you will see all those things about quantum computing and quantum computers. Okay. So thank you very much.